Hello, and welcome to our final Philosophy in the City for spring 2021. So this evening, we're very lucky. We have a guest with us from the University of Utah, Dr. Carlos Santana. Before we get started, though, just want to remind you all of what it is that we're up to. So Philosophy in the City is run by the UCCS Philosophy Department, with the goal being that we really want to point out that you can find philosophical concepts everywhere, and philosophy comes up in the everyday, right? So our goal really is to bring philosophy to the city, because I know sometimes there's this sort of impression that like academics are up there in their ivory tower and who knows what they're doing, right? And so the whole purpose of this series is to really say, like, look, you don't have to be an academic up in an ivory tower to talk and think about these issues. They, in fact, influence all of us in our day-to-day lives. So throughout the Philosophy in the City series, we've done a number of different topics, right? We've looked at race and religion. We've looked at philosophy of war. We've looked at education. We've looked at meditation, right? And mindfulness. And this evening, our focus is broadly environmental ethics. And so we've got a whole other spate of things lined up actually for the fall, which I'll be telling you about at the end. So welcome to Philosophy in the City. What am I forgetting?
Introduce the speaker, maybe?
Introduce the speaker. All right.
Speaker.
Sorry, y'all. It's May. We're all a little bit tired. So as I said, we have a guest speaker with us this evening, Dr. Carlos Santana from the University of Utah. And he will be speaking to us about sanctuary cities, managing immigrant wildlife in the urban ecosystem. Okay, and I do just want to flag, we are doing this virtually, obviously. So if we have any tech issues, just stick with us and we'll get back online as soon as we can. Dr. Santana will be talking to us for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So you are welcome to put any questions or comments in the chat as we go, right? So no need to hold your questions to the end. Throw them in the chat as soon as you think of them, and then we will go through them in the second half of this evening's program. Okay? So thank you all so much for joining us on what I'm sure is a busy Friday night. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carlos Santana.
Okay, thank you guys. So what I do in my research is I hang around with scientists until they run into a problem that they feel like is outside of their purview, and then they hand the problem off to me. And this is one of these issues. So the sort of genesis of this talk was the university gave a bunch of people around campus the ability to go in, take this just spot of giant lawn and do something interesting with it, ecologically speaking. It sits right above a river that's part of our local drinking watershed, and it turns out having a giant turfgrass lawn with a bunch of fertilizer and insecticide and stuff running into the river that people are drinking from isn't great. So we were sitting around a big table, ecologists and engineers and urban planners, and trying to decide what plants to plant on this spot, given all the different things we would want out of this space. And one person there, a conservation biologist, was just obviously the thing to do is to just plant the native species, find which trees are native to that riverside ecosystem and plant those trees. And that was very obvious to the conservation biologist. To most of the other people around the table, that was not at all obvious, because there are things we want out of that spot. We want clean water. We want a space that people on campus are going to be happy looking at and walking through and eating lunch in and things like that. And there's no guarantee that the native species are going to actually do all those things for us. So this raises this question about what role should thinking about native species and non-native species and invasive species play in things like urban ecology and urban planning. And this is something that I, as the philosopher who studies ethics and things like that, could sort of put my 2 cents in. So here's my 2 cents. I'm going to, so here's sort of an apology in advance. Pretty much all my examples are going to come from places that I have lived. So just going to talk about what I know. So I actually want to give you a second. Feel free to put in the chat, and I'll ask our host to let me know what you guys put in the chat. What plants and animals in your cities or places where you have lived do people want to get rid of, or are there even like policies or initiative to try and get rid of? What are the problem species or perceived problem species where you live?
All right, so we're getting a couple answers in here. So we've got pigeons, raccoons, and it looks like cats as well. So if more answers come in, we'll let you know. But so far, pigeons, raccoons, and cats. Oh, and somebody says dogs. I don't know.
I don't want to be friends with the person who said dogs, but no, those are all good answers. Those are all things of which, you know, undergo wildlife control. I have friends who work on these issues in Australia and New Zealand, and they both have massive cat extermination programs going on right now. Australia set a goal to kill 20 million cats over the next 10 years, which has upset some people and makes other people really excited. In New Zealand, they send the elementary schoolers out into the woods with guns to shoot the cats and the ferrets and stuff like that. To protect the native birds and so on. And so those are all really good examples and widespread examples of cases where cities have policies about this sort of thing, and there are initiatives to try and control or eradicate wild and feral members of those species. Let me give you an example that just popped up here locally. I'll need to share my screen. And there we go. And the moderators will let me know if this isn't working. But so this plant in the background here is myrtle spurge, and for a while they were telling people here in Utah it was a good plant to plant in your yard because it's pretty and it is drought tolerant, and since we don't have much water here, it's a good alternative to more water intensive crops. The problem is it turned out to be very tolerant of the local ecosystem, and it's kind of everywhere now. And it's often called an invasive species, as in this headline from last week. So just so you know, the kids that this headline is about, they're perfectly fine. They had a mild allergic reaction to the myrtle spurge and got taken to the doctor, and everything's good now. But I want to call attention to the way that this headline from the Salt Lake Tribune is framed. Invasive toxic plant sends 2 Utah preschoolers to the emergency room. The very first word here is invasive. There are lots of different ways you could have talked about this issue, which again is serious and important to talk about. But you could have forefronted the fact that it was an allergic reaction, and if you have a child with allergies, you should, be careful what plants to interact with. You could have forefronted the fact that it's a toxic plant. There are, of course, lots of native toxic plants like poison ivy and chokecherry and things like that, which also can be bad if your children play in them. But what the newspaper chose to do was to focus on the fact that this is an invasive species. What I'm going to argue is that thinking about whether or not a species is native or invasive just isn't a good guide to whether that species is good or bad, whether or not it belongs in our cities, whether or not we should have policies trying to eradicate it or promote it. Let me give you another local example. Here's Salt Lake City. And I want to call your attention to the foreground of this picture, even though it's the background that's trying to draw your eye. In the foreground picture of the picture here, you should see a whole bunch of non-native species. Now, how do I know that these are non-native species? Well, because this is what Salt Lake looked like before white colonization. It was, to quote the U.S. Army surveyor, who first came to the Salt Lake Valley in like the 1830s, he described it as a bleak and desolate place without a solitary tree to rest the eye. He didn't like it, obviously. And so the sort of historical grassland that this place was didn't really have any trees in it. Now, of course, Salt Lake City, just like any American city, is full of trees. These are all non-native species. But you don't hear too many people going around complaining about that being a problem. and maybe it isn't a problem. And so the species that we do complain about, the problem with them isn't that they're non-native or invasive. That's kind of the direction I'm going to go here. Here's a native species from Salt Lake, Oryzopsis hymeneoides. It's one of the grasses in that native grassland. And you might think, oh, here's a native species, I should let this grow in my yard. I did let this grow in my yard once, and the city gave me a notice that I needed to get rid of it. Why? Well, because it is technically, despite being a native species, a weed under the city ordinances. It presents a fire hazard, it presents an insect and rodent harborage, and of course, these aren't things you want in your city. In fact, you don't want the native ecosystem of Salt Lake City in your city at all, because a native ecosystem is a fire-modified system that is perpetuated by recurrent fire. And most of us don't want recurrent fire in our cities. In other words, that conservation biologist who wanted us to, recreate the native ecosystem on this spot of ground was probably telling us to do something that would have been a very bad idea. Recreating the native ecosystem would have been inviting wildfires onto campus. And that's not something we want to do. So, despite the fact that we have these concerns, there's actually an increasing number of policies and initiatives aimed at promoting native species and eradicating non-native and invasive species in cities, especially in the United States. So, for example, increasingly landscape architects are facing city ordinances which state something like X% of the ground cover in the landscape that you design has to be covered by native species. So just like there's been long-standing like green space laws, a certain percentage of the property has to be covered with greenery. Those laws are being modified to say a certain percentage has to be covered with native greenery. And you have things like NGOs organizing massive removals and eradication of non-native species. So this New York Times article that I've posted here on this slide shows this guy. He's one of thousands of volunteers that were recruited in cities in Tennessee to go around and rip out native plants. I think they ripped out a total of 500,000 that year, and they've repeated it in other years. So on very large scale, we're doing things to promote native species and remove non-native species from our cities. But there are lots of reasons why this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One of them is that it's surprising the extent to which the terms native and invasive species don't have fixed scientific definitions. So don't bother trying to read through all of these different definitions here. These are different official definitions of invasive, not just from the scientific literature, but from national and international organizations. There's even a presidential executive order here, which was signed by Bill Clinton to try and get different federal agencies to mean the same thing when they use the term invasive, though it didn't work. The federal agencies still all have different definitions. Every definition of invasive species I could find has at least one of the following properties. The species has to be non-native, it has to be weedy in the term that it spreads densely and rapidly, and it has to be harmful in the sense of harming ecosystems or human health or the economy. But the definitions don't all have all of these three things, and they sort of sort out these three things in different ways. There are scientific definitions, for example, which just define invasiveness, like the Coulati and McIsaac definition, which has been very influential, just in terms of weediness. And so you could have a native species, which is also an invasive species, and they would argue that something like white-tailed deer in much of the country are such a species because they're weedy and they cause harms, even though they're native to the areas in which you find them, right? But this disagrees with, say, the definition of invasive species used by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So this creates inconsistencies between science and policymakers and environmental activists and so on when they're talking about invasive species. It turns out the situation is even worse when it comes to talking about native species. So I've highlighted here 4 different attributes that you can find in definitions of native species. One is the species are found in places that they could reach their natural dispersal mechanism. So if the species can't swim or fly and it gets somewhere by taking a boat, that would make it non-native, whereas a species that could swim or fly, even if it gets there by hitching a ride on a boat, it still might count as native to that area. You have to specify the time frame under which you're going to consider a species native. Some, but not all, definitions say that to be a native species, it can't have been introduced by human agency. And some, but not all, definitions suggest that the species needs to have sort of co-evolved with the local ecosystem. Again, different organizations, different scientists, different government agencies don't agree on what it means for a species to be a native species. And some of the definitions are just downright awful. Like, take the USDA's definition here, a plant is a native plant if it's part of the balance of nature. It turns out this idea of the balance of nature is not well supported in ecology. It's sort of a defunct idea. And so that's not a scientific definition, it's a sort of definition from folk biology, and that shouldn't be guiding our policymaking decisions about how we manage species in our environment. Even worse might be the US Fish and Wildlife Service definition, which says that a native species is a plant or animal that has always been a part of a particular environment. And if you think about that for just a second, you might realize why that entails that there are no native species. I can see Jen trying to puzzle through this, but the answer is like, no species has existed forever, right? So so at one point there were dinosaurs, right? And there weren't bats and toads and cats and dogs and things like that. And so those bats and toads and cats and dogs have not always been a part of a particular environment because at one point they weren't there. Therefore, there are no native species. So there are bad definitions underlying policies surrounding these species. So this is one reason already to start thinking about why maybe we shouldn't be using these concepts which don't have a whole lot of agreement and often are defined poorly. But I'm going to give you 3 more reasons, and I'll try to get through these in my 30 minutes, though someone can wave at me if I start going too long. So I'm going to argue that native and invasive are not good concepts, at least when it comes to thinking about the urban ecosystem, because they don't help us determine what should stay and what should go. They don't help us keep species from going extinct, and they don't help us determine what will help us provide what are called ecosystem services or benefits we get from the environment around us. So let's start with the question of wildlife management, which wildlife, as I'm using it right now, includes not just animals, but plants and fungi, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to argue here is that whether a species is native or invasive, it isn't going to help us in urban wildlife management very much because of practical reasons. So it's not practical for us to just try and keep all the native species and get rid of all the non-native species. Here's an example. This is the Canada thistle, something that's classified as an invasive species in many cities around the US. I don't know about your cities, but in Salt Lake City, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year on Canada thistle eradication. And many of you probably deal with Canada thistle in your own yards. So I've got pictures here from the WikiHow article for how to get rid of Canada thistle. And step 1 is obvious. You just, snip, snip. Step 2 is wait for the plant to grow back because snip, snip doesn't work. And then WikiHow says, then you pull the plant out, obviously. Put on thick gloves first, and I like how WikiHow includes like a big arrow here, just to remind you that to pull out a plant, you have to pull up. You can't just move it side to side like a joystick or squash down on it, just in case you might get confused. Step 3 is to wait for the plant to grow back, because pulling it out also doesn't work. And at that point, you pray for an infestation of gallflies and weevils, because those prey on the Canada thistle. Now, is that going to get rid of your thistle problem? No. The thistle is too hardy for that. However, if you get gallflies and weevils, that will make the thistle's life a little more miserable, and you can take some cold satisfaction in that. So my point here is that we spend lots of time and money and, send out poor, volunteers to go get their hands poked full of holes by Canada thistles, pulling them out, generally for nothing. Like, the Canada thistles aren't going away, right? That we're spending a lot of resource to get rid of an invasive species, but it's not doing anyone any good. And so, and this is a general problem in the city. Here's those raccoons that people mentioned. This picture I took in Costa Rica, this is a burger joint, and the raccoons are hanging out in the window of the kitchen waiting for their burgers, which they did get after the burger joint closed down. Like, all the leftover scraps go to the raccoons, and the raccoons were very patient and cute doing this, right? So cities are not, city ecology is distinct. What I mean by that is the way a city is not the way a city was when all the native species lived there. We've known this for a long time. So I have a citation here to the guy who identified urban heat islands over 200 years ago. An urban heat island is the idea that cities are just hotter than the surrounding areas, especially, it turns out, at night. And this isn't surprising. You have people burning fuel and lighting lights and things like that all the time. So cities are hotter than that geographical place was historically. What does that mean? That means that sometimes the same plants and animals can't live there, and different plants and animals do better there than would otherwise. Similarly, this is true for basically all parts of what's called the biogeochemical cycle. All of the inputs into an ecosystem. Think about water and nitrogen and carbon and things like that. Like in the wilderness, where does nitrogen come from? Well, it comes out of the air, and it's fixed by plants like legumes who take that nitrogen and put it in the soil. In the city, where does nitrogen come from? It comes from fertilizer and from car exhaust, right? That we bring in the nitrogen from elsewhere. So similarly, in most cities, we bring in water from elsewhere. The reason we can have trees in Salt Lake is because the historically dry place is no longer as historically dry because we have a system of reservoirs and canals and things like that, which bring in water. That humans change the fundamental ingredients in the local ecosystem. And what does that mean? That means it's not the same ecosystem it used to be. The things that decide what cities can, what organisms can live in what cities, what organisms can live in an area have fundamentally changed. Finally, when humans go places and settle in an area, we bring our friends with us. Like, our friends are cats and dogs, but they're also raccoons and pigeons and rats and cockroaches. And maybe they're not your friends, but you're definitely their friend. And anything that likes trash is going to come to wherever humans settle. And those organisms are going to thrive. And that creates a different sort of environment. The most important part of your environment as a wild organism is the other organisms present. And humans radically change that. And if that's the case, it just doesn't make sense to think about what organisms are native because because it's a new environment. The organisms that used to be native are not native to the city ecosystem. I'm not going to dwell on this example, but one thing that drives this point home is if you think about, say, two cities that used to be very different ecosystems, like the desert in Phoenix and the sort of boggy areas around Minneapolis, those ecosystems are now more or less identical, right? You see the same trees, the same turf grass lawns, the same flowers that people plant in their gardens. The same raccoons and pigeons and cockroaches are in those ecosystems these days. The city ecosystem is a new type of ecosystem, and what's native to a city might not be what was native to that geographical area before. So my point here is we've created a new ecosystem, and we don't get to dictate which species could thrive in it or which species can live in it. And trying to manage native and invasive species in the way we often do is sort of just refusing to face the reality that cities are new ecosystems. Point 2, species conservation. So an important motivation for wanting to eradicate invasive species and protect native species in our cities is that we're worried that species might go extinct. And it's true, as in this quote here, that urban development produces great local extinction rates, in large part for the reasons I was just talking about. The things that used to live in the city can't live once it becomes a city. And so they go locally extinct. The question is, does this increase the rates of extinction for species globally? And I'm going to say this is actually more complicated than you might think. And one reason is that the non-native species who come into the city, especially plant species, it turns out, can actually help protect native species. So here's some things that scientists have shown non-native species do for native species. Non-native species, especially invasive species, tend to be very resilient to changes, to changing temperatures, to disasters, whether those are natural or man-made. And because of that, they can help the whole ecosystem be more resilient in the face of human-caused changes like climate change. Non-native species, including invasive species, can provide food and shelter to other species, including threatened species. the bird hiding out in a non-native tamarisk tree doesn't care that that tamarisk tree is classified as invasive. It's just happy to have some place to hide out. And sometimes there's taxa just meaning like say a species that has already gone extinct, which can be substituted by a non-native species. So my picture on the slide here is of a Aldabra giant tortoise, which has been imported to the Seychelles, which used to have its own giant tortoise. But it turns out the Aldabra giant tortoise is a close relative, and it just kind of does the same thing and fulfills the same ecosystem role. In the next session, I'll talk about some of the benefits to humans of non-native species, but I'm going to just move on for right now. Cities, it turns out, can actually be havens for threatened and endangered species. You might think of cities as just a place where nature doesn't exist, or just sort of like death zones. And what these graphs here are showing, and don't worry about parsing the graphs too much, I'll just explain it to you. The graph shows that, yes, the most densely populated, like urban city centers, those definitely are like death zones where nothing lives and grows. But it turns out that that more moderate to high levels of population density actually create great environments where all sorts of organisms thrive, more actually than in agricultural land or wilderness. And the reason is, again, we're importing lots of resources like fertilizer and water to our cities, and we're creating a bunch of diverse environments in our cities. There's a wide array of temperatures and climates and habitats in a city because we build buildings and plant parks and things like this. And this creates a way for all sorts of a large variety of species to thrive together. And so the science actually says that that cities, at least until they reach the densest levels of population, can actually be places where a whole bunch of different species can thrive, and this can help protect species. I'm going to run an example here. I'm going to play a short video about an invasive species, and the host will let me know if the video is not working. I'm drawing here on the work of Ursula Heise at UCLA here, so this thought is mostly hers and not mine.
In the summertime, it's like thousands of them. I wash my car like twice a week because of the bird crowd. And it's all on the ground. It's nice sometimes, but in other times it's very noisy and disturbing. And every morning I'm getting wake up. I know when the bird's coming, before dawn.
It's like if you live around a train or something like that, and they come around, you get used to it. Only time you get a little bothered is like, I think they come around like 5 or 6 o'clock. Right before the sun, again, if you like having a conversation and it's that tree they landing on, it's pretty loud. It's pretty loud, yeah.
It was like 6 a.m. and there was this huge racket outside. I had no idea what was going on. It sounded like cats being prodded and poked, and basically cat torture, like 50 cats being tortured outside my window.
Son escandalosos, pero uno se divierte. Bueno, al menos yo me divierto mucho.
The parrot species that we're seeing right now seems to be just exclusively red-crowned parrots. They're originally from Mexico, from around the Gulf Coast side of Mexico. They number 2,000 to 3,500 in one of the last parrot publications that I've seen. So they're listed as endangered.
Okay, so we've got this endangered and invasive species. And by most definitions of invasive species, the red-crowned parrots in the Los Angeles area are an invasive species. They poop on people's cars, they make tortured cat sounds, they're everywhere, because, well, the reason you find so many red-crowned parrots in Pasadena is that the red-crowned parrots, most of which, were brought from Mexico, or their ancestors, the pet trade sort of decimated the population of Mexico around 30-ish years ago. And so these parrots, they're true millennials. They can't afford to grow up where their parents did. And they really, really love avocados. And it turns out that Pasadena has lots and lots of avocado trees. And this is why the red-crowned parrots have flourished there. And they have flourished. You saw them. They're huge flocks. They are annoying and cause harms. Colin's more cool with them than some of these people. But here's the paradox. There are probably more red-crowned parrots in Los Angeles than in Mexico, right, at this point. They're on their way to extinction in Mexico. but they're doing great with all the avocado trees in Pasadena. And the argument here is, if we really care about species extinctions, the thing to do is not to drive out this invasive species from Los Angeles. The thing to do is to open up the city as a sanctuary city to them. When we call the species invasive, we're taking a particular negative stance towards it. But it's not an invader, it's a refugee. It's a refugee from problems that we ourselves have caused. Like, we're the ones driving this species extinct, and it's found a place where it can be a refugee, and we should offer sanctuaries to those refugees. This is the story here, and this is not like a solitary example. It's a really fun example that I like. And Heiza, the scholar who made that documentary that I showed you a clip from, she likes them too, because she actually has a pet red-crowned parrot. And if you know people and their parrots, like, parrots live like 70 years, so people form lifelong attachments to them. But all sorts of species, this is the same thing. Another example they give in the documentary is these turtles, which are going extinct in the Carolinas, where they're native to, but are doing actually really well in ponds, again, in Los Angeles, right? And they're not native, but it might be the best place for them to live on in the future is in places where they're not native to, in our cities. Again, cities can provide unique ecological resources that can save threatened species. So if we really care about extinctions, we should be thinking about species on a case-by-case basis, and not just thinking, let's get rid of all the non-native species and keep all the native species. That's not what's going to keep species from going extinct in the future. Okay, point number 3, last and final point. In the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a big deal 20 years ago, they came up with an influential framework called ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are just good things that the environment does. Everything from producing food to providing habitat for animals, to purifying the water, to giving us, to being beautiful and providing us with recreational opportunities. All of those are ecosystem services. As you can tell, it's kind of a really vague concept that captures everything, but that's fine. We need concepts like that sometimes. So the question is, maybe there's a possibility that native species are just better at giving ecosystem services, right? So there's an argument that people make, and it goes something like this. Native species have a long history in a place, and species which have that history in the place are better adapted to that particular place than species not from that place. Makes sense? Better adapted species play functional ecosystem roles better. So if you have a species which has been in a place and is adapted to that place, it's going to be better at sort of doing its job in that ecosystem, whether that job is to be a decomposer, or its job is to be a pollinator, or its job is to improve the soil quality. Whatever the species' job is in the ecosystem, native species are going to be the best at doing that job. That's the idea. So, and because ecosystem services are dependent on all the species playing their roles in the ecosystem, native species tend to provide better ecosystem services. If this is true, that would give us a really good reason to prioritize protecting native species in our urban ecosystems. Now I'm going to tell you why none of this is true. So in the scientific literature, the idea that native species are better at performing the ecosystem job is called indigenous functional advantage, and it just doesn't seem to be true, especially in cities. So as we've mentioned, the ecology of cities diverges from the history of the local region, which means that that the native species no longer have that sort of developed over time adaptiveness. If a species is a successfully invasive species, it's better adapted than the native species almost by definition. The reason it's a successful invader is because it outcompetes the native species. And so successful invaders actually tend to be very well adapted. Finally, it turns out that all of the species you were listing to me at the beginning of the talk have already co-evolved to live in our new urban ecosystem. So raccoons that are less shy around humans, well, here's what I want to say. Over the last couple hundred years in the United States, raccoons have become less and less shy around humans. That's an evolutionary change that has happened. Why? Well, because the less shy raccoons are the ones who can go to the burger joint and beg for burgers. And so they get more offspring. And so the less shy raccoons have sort of co-evolved with the modern urban ecosystem. So even the species that you think of as maybe non-native have become natives to the urban ecosystem in the appropriate sense here. And of course, and this is really the clincher, when scientists have looked at whether being native is a good predictor of contributing to ecosystem function, the answer is it isn't. Like, whether something's native or non-native or invasive doesn't tell you very much about this thing. So the point is, that doesn't get, this idea of indigenous functional advantage doesn't give us good reason to like make policies favoring native species. But there's another type of ecosystem service which isn't covered by that argument I just looked at, and that's the cultural ecosystem services, in particular the idea of sense of place. So organisms evolve not only with their local biotic, their biological communities, but also with the local culture and society. And certain organisms play an important role in the way we think about the places we live. We do things like put them on our flags even after they've gone locally extinct, and as the case of bears in California. Or if you've ever been to Tucson, you know that saguaro cactuses are everywhere, like literal saguaro cactuses, but like the iconography of the city of Tucson is the saguaro cactus. Like every sign's going to have the saguaro built into it some way or another, because that particular organism is really important to the sense of place of that place. And it would be sad, it would be a detriment, a cultural loss if saguaro cactuses went extinct, right? It'd be a cultural loss to the city of Tucson and other cities like that. And you can probably think of local species to you, which serve that same role of providing a sense of place. So if that's the case, maybe that gives us a reason to protect native species. I don't think it does in general. Most organisms aren't culturally significant. Sure, those saguaro cactuses are important, but the bats, which are their main pollinators, those aren't culturally valued in the same way, right? In fact, the bats are often culturally disvalued. People are afraid of bats. And so the bats don't provide those same cultural ecosystem services, even though they provide other services like pollinating the cacti. And it turns out that many of the most culturally salient and significant species are not actually native species. So here's the culturally important species, tulips in Holland. Those tulips are not native species. Okay, I'm pulling your leg here a little bit. Tulips actually are native to the Netherlands, but this is Holland, Michigan, which is a city in Western Michigan where they have an annual tulip festival. And the tulips are really important to them there, but the tulips are definitely not a native species in Michigan, right? Maybe here's a better example. Palm trees in Los Angeles. I mean, name a more iconic duo than palm trees in Los Angeles. Most of those palm trees are not native. There's only like one species of palm tree, and it's not one of the common ones, right? However, the palm trees in Los Angeles are busy dying off due to climate change, and people are really worried about it because they don't want to lose these important species to their sense of place in Los Angeles. And I think that's a fair worry, but it has nothing to do with whether or not these species are native. These species are important to the sense of place, despite the fact that they're not native. Or to give another important example, think about wild horses and ponies. Here's some assateague ponies. They're federally protected because they contribute to the sense of place there. Also not a native species, right? But still really important to the sense of place. And it's a good thing that we are protecting these wild horses. I think very few people would say, yeah, we should just shoot all the wild horses, right? But if you were hardcore, like native good, non-native bad, then you should be saying, let's go shoot all the wild horses. Jen's experiencing some cognitive dissonance here. I can see, just a little bit, right? And my point here is that you can have non-native species that play a really important role in creating a sense of place, and that means that we shouldn't be using whether a species is native or non-native as a way of determining what should stay and what should go. All right, so one worry you might have here is I'm saying we need to get rid of that concept of native and invasive in the urban context. And you might worry, well, but what will we use to replace them? We've got to use something. And my answer is there's actually a lot of different concepts from different scientific and planning disciplines that we could draw on for doing this. I'm not going to go through this list here, but what I'm saying here is different disciplines have different concepts for like rating species as good or bad or suitable or unsuitable that we can use rather than the native and non-native labels, which are, I've given you lots of arguments for thinking are not very good labels. And what I'd like to see is for cities and activist organizations and government agencies and so on to stop using native and non-native when it comes to thinking about managing urban ecosystems and maybe consider some of these alternatives. So here, I'll leave this up for until we get into the question and answer session a little bit so that you can have it to look at while you're thinking of your own questions. My claim here is that the concepts native and invasive are poor fits for thinking about the urban ecosystem. They don't help us determine what should stay and what should go, because cities are just not like the way things were. There are practical reasons why trying to force things to be the way they've always been just won't work. Native and invasive aren't good for helping us save species from going extinct, precisely because species can be places where we can rescue refugee species that didn't always live there. And finally, native and invasive, thinking in terms of native and invasive doesn't help us figure out which species are going to do good things as part of the ecosystem and which are going to do detrimental things. That just doesn't map on to whether a species is native or not native. Okay, thank you all for showing up today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. I have my contact information here. If someone wants to follow up with me later, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Carlos.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. There's so many good things and so many things like that I know I want to ask about, and I know Colin wants to ask about. So for folks who are out there watching, please go ahead and put any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and then we will read them off and ask Carlos, and then I'm sure he will give lots of good explanations. So just to get us started,
Yeah, go for it.
So bearing in mind that like I know almost nothing about environmental ethics, perfect. Good, I'm exactly the right audience. So one of the things that I was struck by, right, is the framework that you gave of thinking in terms of management, right? Because I do worry about thinking about nature in terms purely of human management, right? Of something that is to be managed and controlled. Because you might think like, once we put that framework on it, we're already doing something that's sort of slightly problematic or mistaken in certain ways. So I was wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit about this idea of management, and if that's really what we should be up to when we're thinking about sort of urban environments and landscapes and urban ecosystems.
That's great. So, so one of the sort of classic sort of areas of debate in environmental ethics is whether we should take a hands-off or a hands-on approach to nature. And sort of the management framework I've been pushing here is more along the hands-on lines here. And Jen is saying, you know, and a lot of people have these intuitions that we should try and be hands-off with nature where we can, but that's the more ethical approach. That's just not, I just don't think that makes sense in the urban context for a couple of reasons. One, cities are places where we do planning, and we do planning for good reason. Even when we let things be hands-off, we plan for things to be hands-off. So it might be, for instance, that we say, we're going to have this park where we like manicure all the plants, and we're going to have this other urban park where we let what wants to grow, grow. That's cool, right? It's cool to have a hands-on park and a hands-off park. But you have to make a smart decision about why you're going to let a hands-off park be a hands-off park, right? And the reason you have to make that smart decision is because it's in the city and it's going to affect people, right? And you don't want to do something like do a hands-off park and it creates a fire risk that might harm people. When you're planning for the urban ecosystem, and this is something I've worked with some scientists on a paper recently, you have to think about the way it's going to affect people in all sorts of ways, right? So making ecosystem changes can create health outcomes for people, right? So if you plant certain trees, it might make some people happy. It might cause severe allergic reactions for other people. Like if you ask people what trees they want planted, you know, in their neighborhood, they almost always tell you oak trees because that's a tree that people know the name of. Oaks are one of the worst allergen-producing trees, and there are really good reasons not to be planting them all over your cities, right? Or to give another issue, oftentimes an ecologist works with, you know, a city and their urban planners to come up with healthier, more beautiful ecosystems, and it leads to gentrification, and a bunch of people sort of are driven out of their neighborhoods, and this leads to all sorts of bad problems, right? You have to consider all of these issues where a city is, because it's not just like a question that you might be facing in some place like like a protected wilderness area where you can just be like, we'll mostly leave this hands off, right? You can't do that in a city because it's so intertwined with a whole bunch of other ethical issues of public health, issues of social justice, et cetera, et cetera. And so, this isn't saying you can't ever be hands off with things in the city, but you have to do so in a deliberate way. And when you're deliberately being hands off, that's still management.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So we have kind of a follow-up to that question here, which, going to this notion of being hands-off, hands-on, the question is sort of framed in terms of, okay, so when we're talking about the way in which humans engage with the non-human wildlife in the urban environment, how exactly maybe can we go about balancing those kinds of interests, right? So on the one hand, there's the idea that you want to protect the cityscape, protect the or help or benefit the actual people living there. But some of those benefits will come at the cost of the wildlife, be it local or non-local. And so I think the follow-up then is, how do we figure out how to sort of move between what we owe to other humans and then what we owe to the non-human wildlife in the area? Or is there a way of even doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a huge question, right? I'll say this: there are ways of thinking about doing that, right? And you don't want to just like let the pendulum swing too far one way or the other. So obviously, there are a lot of people who are just like, who cares about the non-human wildlife? Let's just do what people want in the cities. But that usually ends up being bad for humans as well in the long run. But we do owe things to other species. And there are people who argue for things. Well, one phrase that's being thrown around more frequently is what's called interspecies justice. And the idea here is something like this. This parrot case is a really good case, right? The parrots are noxious in certain ways. The parrots poop everywhere. They make lots of noise at inconvenient times, and so on. But we have, in some ways, we owe the parrots things because we caused problems for them in the first place, right? And that might give us reason to say tolerate more from the parrots than we might from other pest species, right? So we don't necessarily like owe poison ivy habitat the same way we owe parrots a habitat, right? That we haven't harmed the poison ivy in a way that we owe it reparations. But you might just think in terms of things like what's threatened with loss and what's not, too, right? So again, with the parrots, there's a real threat of extinction if we don't give them some space in our city. Whereas if we are trying to drive bed bugs out of our city, there's no worry that like the bed bugs are going to go extinct anytime soon, unfortunately. All right. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is there are ways there are considerations you can bring onto this, and there are important considerations to bring into it. And I think city planners often aren't very good at bringing these sorts of considerations to it because they're just not trained to think about nature when they're doing this sort of thing. And so it's really important to bring people around the table, like in the example I gave at the beginning of the talk, where we have people from a bunch of different areas of training, some of whom can be like the Lorax and speak for the trees, right? And you negotiate all of these different issues. But you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think there is like a general principle that's just going to say, here's the rule, this is how we'll make decisions about wildlife management in the city, right? There's just too many complicated issues about people, about nature, about economics, about justice, and you kind of just have to negotiate through each of those on a case-by-case basis. But I think that's doable, and it's really worth doing.
Thank you. So we have a question comes in that I think is it actually links up to your point about poison ivy, because this person said you've been using a lot of really cute examples, right? Like horses and like parrots, which I think maybe are cute if you don't live in Pasadena, right? And then raccoons, which I don't know, I found them adorable, right? But this person says, but like, what about kudzu? Right, which, like, to be fair, I lived in North Carolina for like 10 years, and if I could kill every single vine of kudzu, like, I would, and I would feel no remorse. because it's awful, right? And it takes over, and to be fair, like the word North Carolinians use, right, is invasive, because it is literally like a plant invader. And so I think what they're trying to get at, right, is like, what's the cuteness factor here? And does that like play into our discussions at all? Right? Kudzu's not attractive. It's just annoying.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm definitely happy to like try and convince people of my position by using cute examples. But you're right in pointing out that like a lot of the cases, they just don't have that same sort of appeal, right? But I think that the same issues hold, and I think that this example is meant to point that out. Like, right? So a lot of time and effort and money is spent trying to manage the kudzu, right? But so one thing I might say there is maybe that's not time and money well spent just because it's not been effective, right? So I don't know what the cost is precisely for kudzu, but in some of the research I'm doing on this, there's a plant we have out west here, tamarisk, which grows along waterways, and it's considered an invasive tree. And the cost runs anywhere between $2,000 and $10,000 per acre for removing the tamarisk. And it often has to be done repeatedly because the tamarisk comes back, right? And that's a lot of cost for fighting a losing war, right? We are stuck in a forever war against the tamarisk and against the kudzu. And this isn't like a loose analogy. I think it's a pretty tight analogy to forever wars. And it might not be worth it even if we lose something of value by giving up on the war, right? The cost we're paying to continue fighting this war, that's just something we have to sit down and figure out what the considerations of both sides are, decide if that's actually a cost worth paying, if we're going to have to keep paying it in perpetuity. And another thing you might, let's see, what was the other point I was going to make here? So maybe it turns out that it is a cost worth paying, that we should just be going all out in a war against the kudzu. That's a war we have to fight. I think we should be doing this not on the basis of the fact that it's non-native or invasive, but just on the fact that it causes harms, right? So there might be native species which cause harms, which it's worth putting a lot of effort into going to war against, right? So white-tailed deer are probably an example of this in many areas. They cause, significant amounts of human death through car accidents. They cause a lot of economic damage. They cause damage to the ecosystems because they just like are lawnmowers that move through eating everything, right? And given all these harms, you might say, yeah, it makes sense for us to just be sending out a bunch of hunters with guns to shoot them, right? Which is what we do in a lot of places, right? And so we engage in a lot of active management of the white-tailed deer, despite the fact that they are cute, precisely because of the harms they cause, and despite the fact that they're a native species. And the kudzu would say, well, here's a list of the harms the kudzu cause, here's a list of the benefits. Those harms far outweigh the benefits, and so it's worth going after them. But note, in making that argument, I didn't look at all as to whether or not it's a native species. I just looked at the harms and the benefits. And when it comes to our cities, I think that's a fine thing to do. If myrtle spurge is sending children to the hospital, let's try and minimize the coverage it has in our city. If poison ivy, which is native, is doing the same thing, then let's try and minimize how much poison ivy there is in our city, right? And that has nothing to do with one being native and the other not being native, but everything just to do with the effect it has on the local ecosystem and on the quality of life of the humans and other organisms living here.
Oh, I'm so glad I can keep going after kudzu. That makes me really happy. Okay, I think
I was going to say, I'm also glad you mentioned the myrtle spurge case, because that's a nice transition to this next question we have, which is, and maybe this is going to be a short question, because early on you were focusing on how the media or like the news articles depict, right, certain kinds of species and their effects on humans. And so the question is, specifically with regard to the media, right, or like any sort of like popularly consumed information, is there a special responsibility, morally speaking or otherwise, in how to approach and report on these kinds of interactions?
Yes. So of course there is. I want to say a couple of things here. One, is one is to avoid being sensationalistic. And of course, it's really hard for the media to do, right? We want the media to not sensationalize everything. They're going to keep doing it anyway. But you know, the best journalists would avoid sensationalizing things. And I think the case of the reporting about this Myrtle Spurge case is a clear example of sensationalizing things, right? Because again, oak trees every year put a lot more children in the hospital than the Myrtle Spurge does, right? And nobody even recognizes that because it's not something that ever gets reported on. So the media needs to, you know, have a more sort of clear-eyed view of. It's hard to resist the sensational stories, but I think there's just because they're going to fail to meet the ethical duty there doesn't mean there's no ethical duty to avoid sensationalizing things. But the other thing is that there's actually, I think, really good reason to avoid the native and invasive language here. And other people have written about this better than I could, because this is not so much my area of training. But there actually are really close ties between nativist language and ecology and nativist language when it comes to people. So the kudzu actually gives a good place for that. Scholars have gone in and shown the way that you know, kudzu comes from Asia, and the way that anti-Asian sentiment, racism, and things like that, that the metaphors between kudzu and Asian immigrants get made all the time, and talking about non-native organisms and non-native people using the same language reinforces that. It facilitates people making this metaphorical connection between ecological immigrants and human immigrants. And you probably noticed I tried to flip that there, and referring to the parrots as refugees and things like that, right? I think it makes sense for us to talk about ecological refugees in appropriate language, the same way that it's appropriate that the media should not be using terms like illegal immigrant, but instead be talking about you know, refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. In the same way, with the media, I think this is probably less important in this case than the human case, but still important that the media use appropriate language here. Of course, I don't think that's the media's responsibility in the first place. It has to start with government agencies and scientists, right? So we have seen less use of discussion of illegal immigrants about humans, and in part this has been because scientists and government agencies have started to turn against using these terminology, right? And then only after that happens have organizations, have news organizations like put it in their style guides that you shouldn't talk about illegal immigrants. And in the same way, you know, as long as, you know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Agriculture and you know, scientific journals keep talking about invasive species, the news is going to keep reporting on them, right? While journalists have a responsibility there, in this case, I think they're the followers, and the leaders need to be our policymakers and researchers. And to a certain extent, that's my audience. Those are the people that I sit around the table with. Those are the people who are going to read my paper. Journalists aren't going to read my papers and so on. Though maybe there are journalists in the audience today. Who knows?
It could be. It's possible. So speaking as somebody who actually works on just war theory and refugee studies in particular, I was actually sort of quietly cheering when you started to use that sort of language, because I was like, yes, like this is the right way to start talking about this. So I just wanted to like flag that. I was like, yes, thank you. So I actually think what you just said is sort of a helpful transition to another question that we had come in, which is, so I don't know how familiar you are with Colorado, but the state just passed a referendum on reintroducing wolves to Colorado, right? And I think what was interesting and what this question asks is sort of the entire debate about wolf reintroduction to Colorado took place in precisely these terms, right? It took place in terms of sort of like they're a native species. We ought to let them like come back to where they're from, right? Like this was the language, and it was highly successful, right? The referendum passed, and so I think it's gray wolves have now been reintroduced into Colorado. And so the question is, right? Given that this was like a politically successful campaign, right? Are there maybe political reasons to keep these terms around, even though they're not accurate, right? And are like sometimes unhelpful, because you might think sometimes they are helpful, in particular with the wolves. And the comment finishes, "Yay wolves." So I think we have a pro-wolf person.
Yeah, I'm a pro-wolf person too. So yay wolves and yay pro-wolf person. This is a great question, and I am actually really familiar with this issue. For one thing, we follow it closely here in Utah, because it turns out wolves don't know where the state boundaries are. The state boundaries are not that ecologically significant, and so and we already get the occasional wolf coming down from Wyoming. Now that they're coming in from two sides, it's going to be harder and harder to like pretend that Utah can stay wolf free. So this is something that us wolf fans are really excited about here in Utah. And you're right that this way of framing things is really effective. Like, nativism is effective politically in general. Like, you want to get elected, it's not a bad strategy to promote, everyone going back to the place that they're from. It's an ethically suspect one, but it's a politically effective one. And you see this going on worldwide right now, and it turns out it's politically effective for ecological things too, as you saw. I'm going to answer this question obliquely by starting with another similar case that happened just recently, the past couple of years. So Isle Royale State Park in Michigan is an island in Lake Michigan, and it's the site of a really important long-term ecological study, the study of the wolf and moose population. You've probably heard of some of this research when you're to have the wolf debates in Colorado, precisely because of the idea that wolves are a keystone species, right? So the idea is wolves prey on species like moose or deer who overgraze on the plants, which means the plants can be healthier, which means the whole ecosystem is healthier. And the story in Isle Royale is that we got to see all this happen. Isle Royale was decimated by mining and logging. It got set aside as a protected area, as a national park, but the forest had a hard time recovering because the moose would just eat saplings. But one very cold winter, the lake froze. Wolves walked over from Canada, and then the wolves kept the moose in check, and then the forest got to be all foresty again, and they lived happily ever after until the wolves went extinct. Now, why did the wolves go extinct? This is a little island, and they got inbred, and it wasn't enough to support a wolf pack. So the National Park Service had to make a decision. Do we go back to Canada with some helicopters, scoop up some wolves, and put them back in Isle Royale to protect the forest? Or do we just let things be, right? Because, again, without the wolves, the story is the forest wouldn't be healthy because the moose would just eat too much. Moose are big animals. It takes a lot of lettuce to create like a 2-ton murder machine. So the National Park Service decided to do it. They decided to bring back the wolves. And again, much of the debate happened in terms of this like native and invasive. Of course, again, the idea of keystone species, which was important for you guys too, was part of the debate. Here's the twist. The twist to the story is that before the mining and logging, there were no wolves or moose on Isle Royale. Isle Royale had lynx and caribou as its top predator and herbivore. And those were driven extinct by hunting and by the ecological damage from the mining and logging. In other words, the wolf-moose ecosystem that people talked about as a native ecosystem has only been native for a short time period. In other words, they could have had that same debate about reintroducing wolves in Isle Royale without actually talking about what's native, because it was all a lie anyway. Like you could just talk about like making the ecosystem healthy or protecting the ecosystem by bringing in this valuable organism. And I think you can make a politically successful argument in some place like Colorado or Utah or other places where they're thinking of doing wolf reintroductions that appeal to values people have about having thriving ecosystems, about healthy ecosystems, and the role a wolf can play in that, without emphasizing that the wolf it's their ancestral homeland and so they deserve to take it back or something like that. Like, I think that the temptation of making those nativist arguments is one that we should avoid. It's not necessary, and it's harmful. It becomes harmful when we have to start making other arguments for thinking about our ecosystems, where we have to get used to having certain non-native organisms because they're the best thing for the new world we've created. Right? As for example, the climate continues to change. Species are going to have to move around. Right? Most ecologists have just accepted the fact that temperatures are going to change, so species are going to change where they live. Right? If we've pinned our political hopes on making nativist arguments in ecology, that's going to be really bad as we have to deal with the migrations of species to adapt to climate change. And so we don't want to get used to making that argument. It's dangerous not only for the impact it has on natives without humans, but it's dangerous because it sets us up for future ecological failure, even if it wins us short-term battles. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer, but I think it's a really important question, and I think despite the appeal, let's not make those arguments.
No, thank you very much. I think it was really helpful to think about, and I especially liked your points, and we got some comments like, oh, right, like wolves don't know about state borders, right? Like, turns out, right, this thing that Colorado has done has impacts for the states around us, right? It's more of a regional question than a state question. Yeah, because a lot of the debates in Colorado were about like Colorado. And then I do remember some news reports being like, y'all, like, it's not just going to be Colorado. But yeah, no, thank you. That was really helpful. So I think, Colin, you got one?
I was going to say, yeah, we have a few coming in, but we also, pivoting to politics in particular, I think that's a lot of piece. That's a really nice move to make, because this one goes back to the comment you made pretty early on in your presentation about how in the US alone, right, our government agencies can't even really effectively coordinate oftentimes in terms of the language they use, the terminology they use, and the policies they adopt. And one concern you might have is that if we just had the same definitions in place, then it'd be so much easier to coordinate among the different agencies. But I guess this question is kind of, cynical about the ability for, a massive bureaucracy to coordinate like this. The question is the definition issue really something that's at stake? Is it overhyped? Or might there be better ways of approaching on a political level the policies that we need to enact these kinds of ideal reforms that you're talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned Clinton's executive order. That was an attempt to get them to all coordinate and settle on the same definition, right? And it failed. So is there a better way? Yeah. So basically what I'm arguing for is not to lump species into two different boxes. Right? Not just have a good box and a bad box and figure out which box everything goes into. What does that mean? That means when you're making a management decision, you can't just make it in the sort of shoot from the hip way. We're just like, oh, it's native or it's not native, therefore we get to take this action to either eradicate or promote it. Instead, you have to get the stakeholders, including people who can speak for the non-human stakeholders, around the table and negotiate. That's the answer to most things politically, right? The answer is not just have a simplistic black and white apply across the board without paying attention to any of the local nuances sort of solution for complex problems. Think about any sort of political debate, right? Are more taxes good and bad? Or is more regulation good and bad? You can't just say all regulation is good or all regulation is bad. That doesn't make any sense, right? You have to look at the details and negotiate on that particular issue. But by having people who have different values and different perspectives and different knowledge from the issue, all bringing it together, right? That's what has to happen if we want to do rational wildlife management in the United States, right? And there are all sorts of ways in which, I can't paint you the picture of the complete overhaul that needs to be done, but there are certainly lots of different incremental things that we can do to improve on this, right? So to a certain extent, the way we get public input on things on issues of wildlife management outside the city, it's very geared towards certain types of stakeholders and other types of stakeholders. So for example, if you're part of the hunting community, you probably know when the Bureau of Land Management is looking for input on a wildlife management issue. Whereas if you're just if you're part of, say, one of the local Native American tribes, you might not have been made aware of the same opportunities to give input, right? So there's a little thing you can do there. In cities, it's especially important because just the way politics works in cities means that whole groups of people get left out, and it's often the most important people you get on the issue, which is the people who actually live in the neighborhood you're modifying, and the scientists with the relevant expertise, right? That the administrative person in the city's planning department might not have strong connections to either of those communities, right? And so cities have to find ways to do better at getting input from those communities. And it can't just be something like, we're going to put up a comment box on a website somewhere that people can, because it takes active reaching out, right, to get people involved in it. Like, none of us are, not none of us, but like only a very small percentage of us are going to spend our time like going around looking for opportunities to comment to the city on the issues of concern to us. We might not know that those exist. So the city has to do sort of integrated research planning and community coordination, and there are models for doing this, right? And this is not the sort of format to explain what those models are like, but I work with people who are working on developing these models and implementing them, and it's hard to do, but it's worth doing.
No, thank you. I think it's really helpful, right, to think about how these kinds of questions integrate, right, with other things that we do talk a lot about, right? So speaking as somebody who teaches politics and the law, right, I'm forever talking about sort of input and consent, right, and like what does it take to know what you're voting for and things like that. So we have a slightly broader question, which is, how does this discussion link up to broader concerns within environmental ethics, such as sustainability, and such as, right? And so they said you sort of talked a little bit about climate change, but I think the interest here is like, how do we link this up with the concept of sustainability, which might be sort of maybe a more static concept, right? Or a concept of like, if we can just get everything settled, then we'll be like good forever. And so if you could talk maybe about the relationship between your work and this idea, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so you've already hinted about why I'm going to say I don't like the concept of sustainability. It's its staticness, it's conservativeness when we have to just deal with a changing world, right? In some ways, the concept of sustainability is problematic for the same reason the concept of native is problematic. That it's backwards looking when it'd be nice if we could just like flip a switch and everything would stay the same in a nice, happy, wild state with like Bambi prancing around the forest. But that's not feasible. That's not the issue that the applied environmental sciences are facing, right? With there's a whole literature about the pros and cons of the sustainability concept, and a lot of people have pointed out that in practice sustainability often doesn't even mean anything environmental. It often means something economic. It means it means, can we keep exploiting nature to this degree, for a certain amount of time? It means, can we keep having economic growth while we keep degrading the planet, that sort of thing. And the answer to both those questions is no, but but people still want to go for them anyway, right? So some philosophers and ecologists have proposed more ecological ideas of sustainability, but the problem is their ecological ideas of sustainability focus on maintaining the integrity of historical ecosystems. All right, that's basically a direct quote from the most influential definition of ecological sustainability. And look, there are no historical ecosystems anymore. Like the tendrils of humanity have reached out everywhere, right? And cities in particular, of course, as I've argued over and over again, cities are novel ecosystems in all sorts of ways, right? What does it mean to maintain the integrity of the historical urban ecosystem? That's a nonsense question. We have to think actively about how we want our cities to look. We have to come up with new ways of thinking about what it means to ecologically thrive in order to decide what the city's going to be like. And the fact of the matter is, that's true outside the city too. That's true that's true everywhere from from downtown Denver to the most remote national park in Alaska. That things are changing. We can try and mitigate certain changes, but we have to think about which changes to mitigate and which changes to embrace. Right? Let's do what we can to keep the planet from warming too fast. But let's welcome the parrots to Pasadena. Right? And it's not about sustaining the past just for the sake of sustaining the past. Let's sustain the past in cases where that makes sense because it's good, for reasons where you can specify why it's good.
Thank you. I'm loving all of these metaphors, right? As you said, like human tendrils. I was like, great, now we're the kudzu. I was like, yeah, right. And I like that you're like, I mean, you're not wrong. So we have a very specific question, but I thought I'd throw it out to you. So this person asks, what do you think about the idea of wildlife highways, which we've started to build in Colorado? And so, yeah, what do you think about these sort of artificial wildlife highways?
They're great, and they're great things to include in the urban ecosystem, right? One of the ones that we built here in Salt Lake went viral a couple months ago because they're pictures of bears and wolverines and stuff walking across it, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's so cool! It's like right over the freeway," and so it seems like it seems in general like there are just lots of benefits to this, right? There are costs too. But there might be costs that are offset by those considerations of interspecies justice. So here's a major cost of building wildlife highways, especially in urban areas, which is my topic for today, which is you get more wildlife in the city. And sometimes that wildlife is cool. Like, I love it when I get to see a raccoon or whatever, right? In downtown Salt Lake, we have signs to watch out so you don't run over people who don't realize they're standing in the road because they're watching a peregrine falcon. Right? It's great when those wildlife come to the city. It's scary when it's a mountain lion that wants to eat your little Pomeranian, right? And we're increasingly seeing that too, right? As you build wildlife highways, you're going to get more mountain lions in your city, and those are costs you have to think about, and we have to think about how. What's the ethical thing to do about the fact that we have a bunch of mountain lions popping up in our cities where that presents danger to people and pets and wildlife and the mountain lions themselves, right? And those are conversations we should be having more of, but it still does seem to me that wildlife highways are a net benefit. I'm going to give you another anecdote because if you haven't figured it out, I like telling stories. So I had a student who graduated a couple of years ago, and for his master's project, what he did was he just followed a deer around. So it was a deer that was GPS tracked, and he cached some water along the way, went out with a backpack and a friend, and for 3 months, they followed where that deer went for 3 months to understand what it was like to be a deer in the modern world. And it's, this was in a remote part of Utah, which is in a part that's about as remote as you can get in the continental United States. But still, they found it really hard, not so much because they were bushwhacking and stuff like that. That was the easy parts. The hard parts was trying to cross highways and things like that. They'd get to highways where they just found themselves standing there for hours waiting for a time when they could safely cross the highway. But the deer had done it somehow, right? And but in lots of ways that we don't understand, because most of us haven't, followed in the footsteps of a wild animal. We've made it hard to be a wild animal. We interrupted their patterns that they want to follow, and so. I'm all for building wildlife highways. I think it's important, but we also want to think about doing this in a rational way, and this requires good science. And that good science might be it's stuff like this first-person experience. This good science might be thinking about the future. And as species are going to be migrating due to climate change, what highways are going to make sense rather than just planning for right now, which is a big problem with urban planning for these management type things, is they plan for right now, not for climate change. Like the Philadelphia just renovated the sort of river walk on the Schuylkill River. But Schuylkill River is a tidal river, so it gets affected by sea levels. And when they did it, they didn't think about 20 years from now, and sea levels are going to be higher, right? And as cities make this mistake all the time, we can't make this mistake when it comes to wildlife management in the cities.
Thanks. No, this is all fascinating. So the next one we have, it's also a bit of a broad question, but it's a bit more technical. So if you want to explain some of the concepts, terms here for the audience, feel free to. But it goes to the effect of a lot of the arguments we're making here, or that we're hearing here, seem to be dealing with concepts like biodiversity, preservation of biodiversity, and preservation of biomass in the ecosystem. And there's a concern that it seems to be the case that these might be in some sense red herrings when it comes to figuring out what's actually worth preserving or worth maintaining or worth attending to in terms of our responsibilities. So I guess the general idea here is that, so in terms of biodiversity, biomass, right, where exactly, ought we be considering with regard to these concepts? I would also suggest maybe like what do they entail for our broader audience, and why they might or might not be worth valuing from this perspective.
Good. So biodiversity is generally defined as something like the diversity of life in all of its various forms, and biomass is just the amount of the biological material, or sometimes just the amount of plant material in an area. And I didn't use either of those terms in this talk advisedly. So I actually have a whole series of papers where I've argued against the use of biodiversity precisely because it's a red herring. Like what matters in nature is not the variety of life in all of its different forms. What matters in nature is this whole list of wildly different things. The sentience of the creatures in nature, that matters. The beauty that can be in nature, that matters. The economic outputs that nature can give us, there's all sorts of things which matter in nature, and those things aren't the same thing as biodiversity, and they don't actually map onto biodiversity very well. So it's true that a lot of people who talk about these things talk in terms of biodiversity, and biodiversity is a nice buzzword, just like sustainability, just like invasive species. And if there's a pattern in my research, it's that buzzwords don't lead to good decision making, right? That's what I argue. That's what I argue today, is that buzzwords don't lead to good decision making. And sometimes they're politically effective to appeal to, just like as we talked about earlier, right? But it's worth making your appeal in more honest terminology, right? So the fact of the matter is, like, oftentimes bringing in non-native species increases biodiversity. The same people who are like opposed to non-native species tend to be in favor of biodiversity, but most non-native species, when they come into an area, don't displace any existing species, right? So you increase the biodiversity by bringing in a non-native species. So there's a tension there that the people making these claims just don't like to talk about for this reason, because there's an inconsistency. But as a philosopher, I get to point out these inconsistencies and enjoy doing this, and then not get invited to the next meeting to sit around the table. So yeah, what I would say is, like, you have to get this is the same answer I've given over and over again. You have to get the stakeholders around the table, figure out what's valuable. And this can involve people being stakeholders by proxy. Again, there are going to be groups which are not represented at the table, so you have to have people who are going to speak for different components of the ecosystem who can't speak for themselves. You have to have people who are going to speak for future people who can't speak for themselves, right? So, and then you have to figure out what everyone values and try and negotiate the best outcome given that sort of deliberation, right? And you can't just have some technocrat who calculates what decision is going to lead to the greatest biomass in the city. You don't want to maximize biomass in the city, right? Again, maximizing biomass might just be maximizing fire potential. Biomass is not good or bad in itself. It might be something that you want to measure, right? That that once you figure out what people value, you need to figure out how to achieve that, and making good measurements that relate to that, and measuring the number of species in an area or how much biomass is in a place might help you make those decisions. But you don't make those decisions just in the first place on the basis of the amount of biodiversity or biomass or whatever you're going to conserve or promote or whatever. Yeah, that sounds exactly like all my other answers because I'm trying to be consistent here.
Okay, no, thank you. I think this is really helpful. It looks like we've got time for about one more question.
Do you get yours, or do you want?
Go for it.
So this one is, I think, something that just is a timely question to ask. Is in terms of these issues, the question is, what sort of effect has the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, had on the flourishing or lack thereof of these immigrant species in urban ecosystems?
Mm-hmm. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. The answer is we don't fully know yet, right? The research is still coming in, and for much of the pandemic, the research just wasn't happening to the same degree. Just because it was harder to just get people out there to all the different monitoring sites and things like that. A year ago, in my research lab, we were having a Zoom meeting where we invited someone who's doing air quality research to talk about the effect that the pandemic had on air quality, because last year it did improve air quality in Salt Lake. But he said, while it's obvious to all of us that it improved air quality because we've experienced it personally, he actually has less data about the air quality than he would have in a normal year, because he just doesn't have all the same lab members that he can send around to all the sites. And in the same way, a lot of scientific research didn't happen over the course of the pandemic for various reasons. And so the answer to the empirical question of what effect did it have, we don't know for sure yet. There's probably research out there that's just coming out that I haven't read yet, but I don't know. There's a further interesting question, though, and this is something I have written a little bit about, which is, has the pandemic changed attitudes towards wildlife in the city, right? Given that the pandemic was a zoonotic disease, and that we're facing more and more, zoonotic means it's a disease that jumped from animals to us, and that we're actually seeing an acceleration in the number of diseases which jump from animals to humans, largely because of increasing interactions between humans and wild animals in cities, right? And so people have had proposals for ways to modify the way people interact with wild animals. The short version of what I've argued is that if we really want to prevent more pandemics, the thing to do is to end factory farming. That's actually the single greatest pandemic risk, not all the things that people are worried about people running into a bat in the city.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. Thank you for answering all of these questions that rolled in. So we are at time. So I just want to say thank you again. And you're getting sort of lots of accolades and thank yous in the chat. And so this concludes our final Philosophy in the City for spring 2021. Thank you all so much for joining us through sort of pandemic and going virtual and all of these things. We will be back in fall 2021. So our first scheduled event is in September 2021, and we will be talking about social engineering and engineering of urban spaces, especially in terms of robotics and human movement. So I think that should be pretty epic and pretty interesting.
It's gonna be good.
It's gonna be good. So please make sure to join us again in September 2021. Thank you so much again, Dr. Santana, for joining us. We hope everybody has an awesome May and an awesome summer. And thank you for joining us to explore philosophical concepts everywhere. UCCS Philosophy, we will see you in the fall. Bye. All right. I hope